Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bar Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Let us begin tonight's program with the recitation of the Holy Quran and recitation of Salam by Brother Ali Zain with the loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بأصحاب الفيل ألم يجعل كيدهم في تضليل وأرسل عليهم طيرا أبابيل ترميهم بحجارة من سجيل فجعلهم كعصف مأكول صدق الله العلي العظيم محمد وآل محمد صلوات آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بھائی حسین آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بھائی حسین تیرا چہرہ تیری آنکھیں بھول کب پائی حسین آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بھائی حسین چلتے ناقے سے گرایا خود کو جلتی ریت پہ چلتے ناقے سے گرایا خود کو جلتی ریت پر گھٹنیوں کے بل میں تیری لاش تک آئی حسین، بس میں گھبرائی تھی خنجر تجھ پہ چلتا دیکھ کر، بس میں گھبرائی تھی خنجر تجھ پہ چلتا دیکھ کر، پھر کسی مشکل میں گر کر میں نہ گھبرائی حسین۔ کون تھا جو مرنے والوں میں نہیں تھا خوبرو؟ کون تھا جو مرنے والوں میں نہیں تھا خوبرو؟ بھولنے بیٹھی تو کس کس کی نہ یاد آئی حسین؟ بہہ رہے تھے آنکھ سے آنسو تیری رخصت کے وقت، بہہ رہے تھے آنکھ سے آنسو تیری رخصت کے وقت، پھر کوئی آنسو نہ ٹپکا آنکھ پتھرائی حسین۔ تیرا چہرہ تیری آنکھیں بھول کب پائی حسین؟ آج بھی زینب کی آتی ہے صدا بھائی حسین۔ محمد وآل محمد صلوات۔
Jazakallah, Brother Ali Zain. One more loud salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Few lines of poetry in Urdu for the Martyrdom of Imam Taqi alayhi salam. One more loud salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. قید میں مولا تقی شام و سحر روتے رہے، कैद में मौला तकी शामो सहर रोते थे, रोकते भी थे निगहबान मगर रोते थे। कैद में मौला तकी शामो सहर रोते थे, रोकते भी थे निगहबान मगर रोते थे। याद शब्बीर में जब पीट के सर रोते थे, याद शब्बीर में जब पीट के सर रोते थे, दरो दीवार का फटता था जिगर रोते थे, दरो दीवार का फटता था जिगर रोते थे। मरते मरते भी ज़बां पे शय सफदर ही रही, मरते मरते भी ज़बां पर शय सफदर ही रही, मुद्दत क़ैद में आबिद के बराबर ही रही, मुद्दत क़ैद में आबिद के बराबर ही रही। इनके रोने से हज़ारों का जिगर नर्म हुआ, इनके रोने से हज़ारों का जिगर नर्म हुआ। मुअतसिम पहले ही जलता था पर अब आवर जला, मुअतसिम पहले ही जलता था पर अब आवर जला। मिलके दरबान से आखिर वो उन्हें जहर दिया, मिलके दरबान से आखिर वो उन्हें जहर दिया, जिसके पीते ही कलेजे में गिरा तीर क़ज़ा, जिसके पीते ही कलेजे में गिरा तीर क़ज़ा। कुछ वसीयत के भी लिखने की ना मोहलत पाई, कुछ वसीयत के भी लिखने की ना मोहलत पाई, क़ैद में वारिस काज़िम ने शहादत पाई, क़ैद में वारिस काज़िम ने शहादत पाई। बर मोहम्मद व आले मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मद व आले मुहम्मद व अज्जिल फरजहम। Respected sheikhs, respected Sayyid, elders, brothers and sisters in faith, assalamu alaikum wa alaikum. My condolences to all mu'mineen on the martyrdom of Imam Taqi alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Tonight we are honored to host Sayyid Hasan Ali Rizvi here at CFK. Jazakallah Sayyid for accepting our invitation once again. And we are grateful for your presence and excited to listen to your speech. Just a few reminders before I request the Sayyid to begin. A reminder about our Dallas Youth Group's Summer Youth Lounge activities happening through the month of June. We have middle and high school brothers programs with Sheikh Muhammad Al-Sadi every Monday and Wednesday, 3 p.m. through 6 p.m. And middle and high school sisters programs with Alma Zahra Hamha every Tuesday and Thursday, 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Youth is invited to come to a safe place to hang out, play games, and enjoy themselves with sessions with Islamic scholars through the month of June at the DYG Youth Lounge. As always, event details are posted on our webpage, cfkdfw.org, where you can subscribe to our WhatsApp group, sign up for our newsletter, and also donate and sponsor nights like tonight. For opportunities to help behind the scenes, or if you have any questions, please speak to myself or any of the existing volunteers. Before I request the Sayyid to begin his speech, I would like to request that we recite a Surah Fatiha for the marhumin of tonight's program sponsors. Let us please include all our marhumin and the marhumin of the Ummah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. I would now like to request the Sayyid to please ascend the minbar with the loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajahum.
Please recite one more loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Smart Sheikh Muhammad Saadi, Mu'mineen, Mu'minat, brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman, Salamun Alaikum wa Rahmatullahi wa Barakatuh. First and foremost, I'd like to extend my condolences to all Mu'mineen and Mu'minat, as today on the 29th of Dhul Qa'dah, we commemorate the Shahada anniversary of our 9th beloved holy Imam, Imam Muhammad ibn Ali, al-Jawad al-Taqi, alayhi salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa. And secondly, of course, I extend my thanks, as always, to the community here, the City of Knowledge community, for their kind invitation, and for those who are present here tonight and will be listening and hopefully will benefit from what is said here tonight. Now, normally when we have these discussions, right, we give, let's say, a story from the Imam's life, or we give a hadith and start expanding on it, something like that. The way that a lot of speakers, the style that they choose is, they'll mention the story or they'll mention the hadith, and then afterwards, then they'll kind of go back for analysis, or they'll mention the points afterwards, right? So they give you the sort of main part, and then the punchline comes afterwards, right? The analysis. I want to do something a little bit different today, meaning the exact opposite. I want to give you the punchline first. I want to give you what to think about ahead of time, and it's on purpose. I won't explain why till later, so there's two punchlines technically. Main punchline number one I'm giving you now, which is the theme for tonight, which is the idea of patterns, or specifically pattern seeking, pattern recognition. So that's what I want you to keep in the back of your minds. Now again, why are we doing that? After, let's say, depending on time, we'll go through maybe one of these famous stories during the Imam's life, analyze that a little bit and see how this idea of pattern or pattern seeking or pattern recognition applies. And if we have time, if Allah grants us tawfiq, maybe another one or two other stories from his life. So, the story that I want to start with, that I'm sure many of you have probably heard before. For the later Imams, I think as we get later towards the ghaiba, the amount of information that we have about the A'immah, starts to reduce. And I mean that in two ways. One is, in the history books, right? Obviously, in the beginning, there's a lot more recorded, right? For the first few Imams, there's a lot of information there. As you start getting closer and closer to the ghaiba, the information about them, in a sense, also goes in ghaiba too, right? We don't get too many stories. We don't have much information. So that's one sense. So obviously, in the books, the information becomes very, scarce. And obviously, then by default, or by extension, we as the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, our information then about the later Imams also is going to become rare and scarce too. Because we're, as individuals who are usually getting this information from the minbar, from, wiladat, shahadat, occasions like this, that's where we're usually drawing that. Occasionally, you'll have somebody that'll go and read a book. We'll call that a mu'jiza, if somebody's out there actually reading something. But otherwise, we wait for the stories to come on the minbar, right? And normally, because there's only, especially for these last few Imams, there's really only two or three, there's a handful of stories, but two or three of them are just repeated over and over and over again, right? So this first one that I'm sure, again, you probably have heard before. It's regarding, the main issue behind it is something that's a debate in two different ways. It's a debate amongst Muslims and non-Muslims, and it's also an intra-Muslim debate as well. And it has to do with the punishment regarding somebody who's caught stealing, right? Now normally, with non-Muslims, they always have a problem with us and our penal code, right? They don't like the way that we decide to deter crime, and we have this sort of, punishment system. Usually they don't like the punishments that Islam deals out. So the, stronger opinion, obviously, is debated, is when somebody is caught stealing, then something's supposed to happen to their hand. Now, what exactly happens? As many of you know, even among the Ahl Sunnah and the Shia, there's a debate about what exactly should happen. What are we supposed to do there? So this debate, this situation also took place during the time of our Imam. The way that we have this story reported in some books is that it's coming from one of the famous qadis of that time, a famous Sunni or Abbasid judge by the name of Ibn Abi Du'ad. So he was a judge, a famous judge during the time of Mu'tasim. So the history books say that the 9th Imam lived during the time of 3 of the Abbasid Khulafa, first being, of course, Ma'mun, then his brother Mu'tasim, and then after Mutawakkil. So this is now the second, right, Mu'tasim. So when this judge is narrating an incident that's happened in his life, he's telling one of his other companions or friends. And he's telling them, he's like freshly coming from the palace or the court or something. And he tells his friend, I wish I had died 20 years ago. His friend's like, this is a weird way to start off a conversation. Like, what do you mean you wish you died 20 years ago? He's like, what happened? He's like, because of what happened today in front of Mu'tasim, which obviously he refers to him as Amir al-Mu'mineen. We obviously don't. He said, the embarrassment that I faced today in court makes me wish that I had died 20 years ago. So obviously friends like, don't leave me in suspense. What happened? What's going on? He says, okay, all of this is because of Abu Ja'far, meaning the 9th Imam. He says, when I was there in the court amongst all the other judges, because in that time, right, the Khalifa of the time would be there, and normally, especially when they needed to deal out a punishment, the judges would usually gather and they'd give their opinions on what should be done in certain situations. So somebody comes into court or comes into the palace and they confess. They said, I've stolen. They confess to a robbery and they say, I want the punishment dealt out. I stole something. I want the Islamic punishment done to me. And I want to be purified through that punishment. Okay? So now, Mu'tasim's like, okay, let's do the punishment then. It's like, I know the punishment is to cut the hand, but I don't know where from. Now, why he doesn't know, I'm not sure exactly. He doesn't really mention here. But he needs to know now what to do here. So he asks his judge, okay, where do we cut from? Some of the judges respond, they say, no, you've got to cut from the elbow, right? That's where you're cutting, because yad is here, all the way down, that's what you cut from. Some others, again, all technically what we would call Sunnis, right, in the Abbasid court, some say, no, that's too much. You have to cut from the wrist. No, that's all. They start going back and forth, debating amongst each other, and they start to provide their evidence, right? Because Mu'tasim's like, look, you can disagree, but you need to give me evidence and convince me. So what's your evidence? So the first group, the one that said up to the elbow, they said, we're going to go to the Quran, we'll give you the evidence. So they quote the famous ayah of wudu, right? In Surah Ma'idah, Surah 5, ayah 6, right in the beginning, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, mu'mineen, right? Those who have iman. Idha qumtum ila salah. When you get up, get ready for salah, namaz, faghsilu wujuhakum, right? Do ghusl of your face, wash your face. Wa aydiyakum ila al-marafiq. And your hands or arms, depending on how you want to translate yad or aydi, ila al-marafiq, up to the elbows. They say, see, we've got an instance of yad or hand being mentioned here, and it says hand up to the elbow. Mu'tasim's like, okay, that sounds good to me. All right, let's cut from the elbow. The other group's like, hold on a second. What are you talking about? Like, that's saying hand up to the elbow. That's not the definition of a hand. How can you use an ayah out of context like that? We've got another ayah for you. The same part, just go further down when Allah's talking about tayammum. Right? You go down farther in that same ayah, ayah 6. فَتَيَمَّمُوا سَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. So when you do tayammum, use dirt, or use sand, or dirt. فَامْسُحُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ. Then do mas of your face. وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ مِنْهُ. Now, wujuhukum obviously would be head over here for us, but let's leave that aside. وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ مِنْهُ. So now he's like, over here, yad is mentioned, again, right? أَيْدِيَكُمْ, the same thing as before, but إِلَى الْمَرَافِقْ, up to the elbows is not mentioned. And again, the second group is telling the first group and telling Mu'tasim. So over here, we know that when we're doing tayammum, it's just this part. So obviously we're cutting up to the wrist. Allah's mentioning yad here. We know the extremities and the limits of that. So we're definitely not supposed to cut from the elbow. We cut from the wrist. That's it. So then it gets louder and louder. They're arguing back and forth. He said, look, we're not going to solve it like this. He's like, so I need you to go call Abu Ja'far. And again, he's calling for our beloved Imam, Imam al-Taqi al-Jawad, alayhi salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. He says, bring him to me. We need to get his opinion. So when the Imam now is kind of forcibly brought to the court, Mu'tasim gives him the situation. Look, this is what happened. What's your fatwa? What's your verdict? What do you have to say on this? First thing Imam does, he says, if they've given their opinions, meaning the other judges, then excuse me. Like, I don't want to give my opinion. Mu'tasim then swears. He says, Wallah. He's like, no, you must give your opinion. And the Imams, this is a whole discussion in itself that I'll mention, but I'm not going to open up. The Imams were very, very sensitive to this idea of people swearing upon Allah. They didn't take it lightly. So he says, look, since you've taken a great oath, you've used Allah's name, fine, then I'll mention something. Only because you've done that. I'll give my ruling. He said, this group that says from the elbow and that group that says at the wrist, both of them are wrong. He says, all you can do is fingers. Mu'tasim's like, okay, third opinion, great. You have to give evidence too. He said, okay, my evidence then is going to be in two parts. So first thing he says, I'm going to quote from my grandfather, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And he quotes this hadith from him, As-sujud ala sab'a a'ba. That sujud consists of 7 parts, right? Al-wajh wal-yadayn wal-rukbatayn wal-rijlayn, right? So obviously you have the face, you have, or forehead technically, then you have the 2 hands, or as we know, palms, then you have the knees, and then you have the feet, or toes. It's like, so these are the 7 parts of sujud, okay? Now you hear this, like, okay, well, where are you going with this? Sujud is on these parts, okay, next. It's like, now that I've given you this hadith, now I'll give you the Quran to match it up. So he says, look, if you were to cut from either the elbow or the wrist, then obviously this person now can't do sujood then, right? Because their palms won't be able to touch the floor. So then their sujood is gone, right? The place, the way for them to do sujood, now you've cut that off. It's like, okay, now where are you going with this? He says, Surah Jinn, Surah 72, Ayah 18, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa anna al-masajid lillah, that the masajid are for Allah. Now over here, masjid or masajid, there's 2 different ways to look at it, right? One is masjid meaning a place that we go and pray, or secondarily is anything or any place that has to do with sujood. Anything that's required to do that sujood in the first place, right? Masjid literally is a place where you go and do sujood, where you go and do worship. He says, Allah is saying that the masajid belong to Allah. How can you cut off a place and something that's Allah's property? If you cut off the palms, a place that's required, as Rasulullah said, for sujood, if you cut that off, then he can't make sujood, meaning you've cut off Allah's property. That's not something for you to cut off. When he hears this, he says, I'm satisfied, good enough for me. Now that is the verdict. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. How many have heard this story before? Anybody? Yeah, a few of you probably have heard this story, right? Sheikh, I think you've heard this story. So I'm sure this is a fairly famous story, right? Especially from the 9th Imam. There's usually, I think, at least when I was growing up, it was this. There was, I think, one Mu'jiza story, maybe one debate with, another person. That's pretty much what we have. So this one's been told a lot. Now, there's a few things. Remember, the theme that I wanted to talk about was about pattern and pattern recognition, right? That was the theme I wanted you to keep in the back of your mind. Now, you might be thinking, what does that have to do with this story? Well, a few kind of preliminary points. One is, this story itself, our ulama, some have some serious issues with this. They're like, we've got some problems here. Now look, I'm not going to bring up this whole authenticity, whatever stuff, right? I know that's everybody's favorite word, like probative force, hujjiyah, authenticity, tawatur, and all that. Let's put that aside. Let's leave it to the people of hadith to discuss that stuff. But there are some maraji' and ulama who say, look, there's some weakness over here. But they said that there's something beyond that that's more of an issue for us. So look at the way that the imam is trying to go about proving his point that it has to be cut at the fingers. The sayr, the tartib, the sequence of his argument is that sujood has these 7 parts, right? That's what we need for sujood. The masajid, meaning the parts of sujood or sajda, those belong to Allah, so they can't be cut. They can't be tampered with. They belong to Allah. They're His property. Now, as far as most ulama agree, when a thief is caught the second time, and there's a punishment for it, it's fairly unanimous as far as I understand between Sunni and Shia. The punishment, or at least for the Shia, this is the idea, that when somebody's caught the second time, so if the first time is fingers, the second then, when they're caught, is that the front part of their left foot is cut. Second time they're caught, the front part of their left foot is cut. Now, if that's what Shias and other Muslims agree with, Now go back to what the Imam said. If the Imam said, no, the parts for sujood belong to Allah, but then, and that's why you can't cut it, but we are in agreement that, okay, but if you're caught a second time, then you have to cut the front part of the left foot. Say, hold on a second, I thought you just quoted your grandfather and said that, no, the feet belong to Allah too, or technically the toes, right? How are you going to cut that off? So the logic that you applied that we can't cut the palms or the hands, how is that logic now applying for this? Wouldn't we apply the same thing here? Say, no, you can't cut feet as well then. How is that possible? What's going on over here? And this is one of the reasons why our ulama say, look, this story then, it can't work, or if it does, there's serious issues over here. How would the Imam try to present an argument in front of everybody when everybody there knew that, no, when somebody's caught a second time, we all are in agreement that another part of sujood is going to be cut. So this whole principle that the Imam allegedly is trying to give is invalid then. It doesn't make any sense. And if these other judges knew their fiqh, assuming they knew the things, they would have mentioned that, wouldn't they? So the ulama are like, this story seems, shaky. We're doubtful in this. Now, going back to this point about pattern and pattern recognition, the reason why most of us, upon hearing this story the first time, the reason we're going to accept it is because we don't know this ruling for the foot, right? If you don't know that ruling, you just hear the first part, this is va 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 subhanallah, like the Imam made these other judges look foolish, like great. If somebody knows the ruling for the foot and they hear the story, they're going to be like, that doesn't make sense. This logic then is not applying. And they can try to reconcile. There's ways you can, sometimes they say, eat like that, right? You kind of go around the other way and try to milk the hadith in different ways, right? Some people say abuse the hadith in a way. Say, okay, maybe the Imam was doing taqiyya, or maybe he was just trying to make a point to everybody, but you're forcing it now. Like, why do that? Why do you have to make this authentic and try to get this principle out there? There's other ways of arguing the point. There's other riwayat or other ayat of the Quran that we could rely on. Why is there so much emphasis on this story specifically? So the idea of the pattern or the pattern recognition idea is for us, our ideas that we have about Islam, when we're presented with information, naturally we're going to try to follow a certain type of Islamic pattern. What we understand is the language of the Ahlul Bayt, alayhimus salam, the language of Allah, the Quran, the Sunnah of Allah, Islamic theology, all these things. So when we hear a story, we hear a hadith, we naturally then, with all this pattern-seeking, pattern-recognizing behavior that you and I have, we automatically become authenticators. We say, that doesn't make sense, or it does make sense. We hear something a hadith where the Imam says, Islam is halid din illa al-hub, right? The deen is nothing but love. Everybody says, yeah, of course that came from the Imam. That sounds amazing. But then they bring the second part of the hadith, illa al-hub wal-bughd, right? It's hate and love and hate. They're like, no, the second part we don't like though. My pattern recognition software threw an error. I don't like the second part. What do you mean love and hate? I don't like that. The first one I like. The first part I like, but that second part, maybe we should cut that off and maybe not put that, when we're sharing our riwayat. So we have all been primed, inculcated with certain pattern recognizing software, or these algorithms, even when it comes to Islam. Now, this happens not just within Islamic stuff, this is for everybody. All humans, especially those in specific disciplines and sciences, in certain jobs, part of their expertise is to look for and find these patterns, right? Obviously, I know there's people here, medical field. When you're looking for, let's say, symptoms, you're trying to recognize and see certain patterns there, right? To lead to a certain disease. Most of these books that are there are trying to show, like, follow this sort of pattern. If you see X, Y, Z, all these things, then this is most likely what the actual disease is, or this is what's going to be the diagnosis, right? Follow this pattern, right? In psychology, right? DSM is for that purpose, right? Here's the pattern. Do you see this kind of behavior? This is what it should lead to. This is the diagnosis, etc. This is probably the mental issue that the person's probably suffering from. In, let's say, anybody who's in, let's say, finance, accounting, anything having to do with money, or let's say taxes, auditing, things like that. Normally, it's almost the opposite. You're looking for a specific type of pattern or certain regularities. If you see an irregularity there, right, the pattern gets broken, then you say, all right, there's something off over here. Now I have to go do a deeper dive then, right? Something seems off. Something doesn't fit the pattern. Now I have to go and investigate that. You can apply this to those who are in, like, programming, right? Same thing happens when you're trying to debug something, right? There's patterns that naturally follow in every discipline, in every science, right? Things don't work with chaos. They work in these systematic, ordered ways. And that's how we're all structured to look at things as well. Every science and discipline has that, including Islam. Now, the question is have we been given the correct pattern recognition system in the first place? When we are presented stuff on the minbar, online, wherever, we are hearing these things, have we been given the type of pattern recognition system, the Islamic one, a divine one, a Tawheedi one, where we can actually, with accuracy, just plus or minus however many degrees, figure out whether something really has that fragrance of Islam or not? That no, this really does sound like the Ahlul Bayt or not. Do we have that system or not? Let's discuss a bit more. If you can recite it. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Most of us, the way that we get our patterns in the pattern recognition system, we want to be, the reason I mentioned, I want to tell you why, right? So I mentioned to you in the beginning that I told you the theme, that it was about patterns and pattern recognition. I told you to keep that in your mind for a reason, right? Because if, let's say, I didn't mention that, and then I mentioned this story, and then we started doing the analysis afterwards, your mindset and your takeaway would have been one thing. Since I mentioned to you ahead of time, patterns, pattern recognition, your mind was already primed for something. So when you were listening to the story, maybe to some degree you were kind of looking for, like, well, I got the punchline, now let me see if I can make the connections, right? You were primed ahead of time. When we're looking for anything in Islam, the same thing has happened to us every time. We've already been given certain Islamic themes, like love, right? Like rahmah. Sometimes for us it's adab or strictness. All these different ideas that we have been fed from a young age, that we've been taught in madrasa, that we've been hearing from the manabir, right, the minbars, the pulpits, in different speeches. Maybe we've read certain books by certain types of authors that were a part of a certain school of thought. And as we got stronger, or I'd say more, I'm using tunnel vision here, somewhat in a negative sense, not exactly, but that pattern recognizing software became more and more distinct, right? We weren't now able to see all these different variations. We heard the same stuff over and over and over again, so we started developing a very closed sort of way of viewing it. The lens that we use now to see and hear and listen to everything Islamic becomes very, very restricted. So now when I'm hearing something, if I've been primed with this, lovey-dovey, as I call hippie Islam, like it's all love, Allah loves everybody, you can sin, he doesn't care, you'll go to heaven, Shias are the blessed ones, all that stuff, then when you hear something that seems unloving, then you'll say, no, that can't be my Imam. What was that? What book was that? No, that book, that's inauthentic. Like that's because of the pattern recognition software. When you start to hear things that don't click with you or me, I don't like the way that sounds, then there's an automatic, because we've been preempted to it, we've been primed for it, then I'm going to toss it out. And it works the other way too. If somebody has, again, more of a traditional, conservative, restrictive, ihtiyati, precautionary background in terms of how they've been raised, when they hear all this rahmaniyah, this expansiveness and openness and love from Allah, they're like, no, the God that I was raised with was like the God of hellfire and brimstone. This one sounds too loving. I don't like that. This sounds a little strange. Especially if this happens with certain groups in terms of fiqh issues. A lot of people, for various reasons, they've grown up with a very strict way of how ahkam and fiqh is applied in daily life. I have to be careful of eating this food. I have to watch out for this. Taharat, najasat, right? Make sure wear sandals and chappal in the bathroom. We have to be very, very careful. If it's wet, oh my God, I have to watch out. Where, generally speaking, the ahkam is very, very open. Almost every single principle that we have in usul, or that's applied in fiqh, that are marajid, pretty much, utilized for us, that we are supposed to apply, is that, look, generally, as long as you don't have yaqeen otherwise, everything is tahir. Generally, if you don't have evidence otherwise, everything is halal, right, outside of meat. Then you have to have yaqeen that it's, halal, properly slaughtered and everything. If you don't have, yaqeen, then otherwise. You don't have this and that. If you forget something, don't worry. The principles that we generally have are all these open ones. But when you tell somebody who's been, again, primed in a way of, no, Islam is very closed and very strict. One strand comes out, you're going to hell. You mess up your namaz a little bit, going to hell. Like, oh my God, right? This, I would say, forgive me for using this language, religious OCD ends up developing like that, right? And this is actually the phraseology that some ulama use. They say, our ulama of the past, because they had some level of this religious OCD, it came in their books, in their speeches, and then I'm going to be careful of the words I'm using here, it penetrated our minds and our souls too. So we ended up inheriting or contracting that same disease of being overly precautious when the Sharia never demanded that. And again, I'll give you a simple example, hopefully. It's going to be a gross example, but it's a simple one, and hopefully it'll drive the point home. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So I mentioned taharat. Let's go with bathroom stuff, right? Let's say you walk into this bathroom, and as you're going in, there's this big puddle on the floor, right? Now, let's just say, for example, you decided, for whatever reason, you didn't wear the slippers, the chappal. So you just walk in barefoot, or maybe you have your socks on, and you stepped on it. Now, regardless of the ahkam, I'd say probably wash your feet, regardless. But now there's a fiqh issue over here. Is your foot najis or not? Now, most of you would say, look, it's in the bathroom, it's wet, it's gross, no way, my foot is najis, right? And that's where a lot of people said, look, that's why we have this whole slipper system in the first place, right? To keep, keep it clean, keep out of people stepping into najasa, things like that. But again, forget all that. Let's just say it happens where there's some wetness and you accidentally touch it, you step on it. Most of us, and I'll tell you, that's the way I grew up too. Most of us are primed to say, no, my foot is najis because I stepped in something in the bathroom, it's wet. I know what it probably is, right? I saw some kid come in here before and who knows what happened. So it's probably najis, right? Some people are confused at I'm not going to illustrate the analogy for you. Hopefully it made sense enough for you. Right? I don't need to draw the full picture. But the principle actually is this, is if you have yaqeen that it actually is najasa, then it's najis. Otherwise, if you don't have information, then it's not najis, it's considered tahir. And the same thing applies then, if I extend it out to a non-gross example, you're talking about, let's say, any restaurant you go to, which I'm not advocating for, I'm just telling you the Sharia, right? A lot of people have these questions about when they go to these, forget whether it's Muslim-owned or not. Let's just say you go to some typical American chain. Right? You're gonna get something simple, get a salad or whatever, I don't know, anything. And then some people, the shak jumps in. What's going on in the back? Are they washing the plates properly and the utensils and the glasses and who's wearing gloves and what are they touching? And I think that person's an atheist, and they start going nuts. And from a lot of us, in our backgrounds too, this, I'd say more so, it less so applies in American restaurants. It more so applies when you have a Muslim-owned restaurant when there are mushrikeen who are working in the kitchen, right? If you know what I mean. That's when, especially desis, they're like, no, there's a problem. They're najis, and then they're cooking back there. I know what's going on. We can't eat there. I know what's happening. What does the actual fiqh say? So look, did you see them with wet hands cooking all this stuff? You didn't. You don't have to go back in the kitchen. You don't have to go and investigate. You don't need to walk in there with your bird watching binoculars and examine everything. You don't need a microscope to look at all this stuff. You can sit at your table. I don't know that anything's happening back there. I don't have to investigate. Allah didn't tell me to investigate. It comes there and enjoy. That's it. That's the principle. If you decide not to eat there and want to do your own precaution out of your own preference, that's fine. But there's really nothing in the Sharia, generally speaking, that's going to say that that's the rule and you have to do that. But a lot of people, they've made it super, super difficult on themselves. Again, it's kind of going beyond. And then I'm saying the same system is applied all over the place now. Every time they hear a fiqh ruling, they hear an akhlaqi principle, they hear a theological issue, they hear something in philosophy, whatever it is, whatever the pattern-seeking system and recognition system has been primed in, that applies now everywhere else. And this has been something that's been damaging, I'd say, both to those of us who have emigrated from different places and have been raised one way, and those of us who, let's say, are born and raised and inculcated in a system over here too. Now, what's that other side? Because I mentioned the kind of strict, conservative, whatever side. Let's attack the other side a little bit now, if you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Nowadays, especially given the month that we're in right now and the events that are taking place, people have to figure out what their stances should be when they're dealing with the Rainbow Rangers, right? The alphabet gang, right? A lot of people, I think hopefully you know what I'm talking about, right? A lot of individuals, because of the way they've been primed, I'd say more on the leftist side, again, Islam, lakum deenukum waliyadeen, la ikraha fid deen. Islam is about love and tolerance and peace, all that stuff. That's how they're primed. Alongside that, they're inculcated and given a certain system of, if you're, go to public schooling systems over here, the sort of Americanized, westernized ideology of what a society should look like, what a civilization should look like, what's the ideal political system, right? All these things. So now you have this lovey-dovey type of Islam, which is all about love and tolerance and peace, and we love everybody. And then you have a system which also says, let everybody do whatever they want, very individualistic, as long as they don't harm you, whatever. And you put these two together, and you got a very, very dangerous combination. Because now when all these social issues start coming out, and people are now asking us, what's your stance? Again, pattern recognition system. Oh, Islam says we love everybody. The Imams never went out and fought anybody. We tolerate everybody, right? Again, we misquote, I would say, and abuse these ayat. La ikrah fi din. You can't force anybody. No compulsion in deen. No compulsion there. Lakum dinukum waliya din. We can live our own ways. There's plurality. Do whatever you want. It's okay. That's the way Islam is. We're not living in a Muslim country, so, wow. What's the problem here? A lot of us have been primed like that. So when these issues come up, we respond just like that and say, yeah, you can do whatever you want. It's okay. Is that the actual way that we should be approaching these things, though? Or have we been misprimed? Has our Islamic engine system been misfiring this whole time? We think that it's working, but it's actually not. Yeah, we get a few points right when we're using that pattern recognition system, but a lot of these issues then, when we're trying to apply it, in this day and age, we completely miss the mark altogether. Let me give one more story. Hopefully it'll make a bit more sense if you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So many of you also know that one of the other famous stories around the time of Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam is the difficulty and the controversies regarding his imamah in the first place, right? So not just as a story of what happened when people were not sure who's the next imam, right? After the 8th imam passes away, like, okay, who's the next one? So they see this young kid who, I believe at that time, the imam was, I think, 6 years old, right, if I'm not mistaken. So 6 years old, and as we also know, very famously, he was darker skinned. So for many of the Muslims there, the Shias, 2 red flags were raised. They said, the imams have never ever been this young. Nobody's ever started off imamate at 6 years old, so that doesn't make sense. So how is this kid going to be the imam? And second, the imams have all been fairly similar in their, their, let's say, racial, their skin color, melanin level, whatever you want to call it, right? So they've all looked fairly similar. This one is this is, it's much, much darker. Again, what's going on here? Their pattern recognition system's thrown off. They have developed a certain pattern of what imamate should look like. This is what imams should look like and act like in their age and whatever. This is what it should be. This imam's not fitting the bill. He's not fitting the pattern. So this is why, for some at least, there was a debate. Now, was that something they were saying to hide another reason? That's a longer debate. But some were sincere in the fact that, look, they're just trying to figure out who the imam is. And what do they have to go on? They're like, well, of course we're going to go back on what our forefathers did. We're going to go back on the Islamic culture that we've been passed down with. Sound familiar? What our parents did and our grandparents did in their Islamic structure of how to organize their communities, we've been dealing with that. So why would we break away from that tradition? Why would we do anything different? That's the way we've been functioning, and nothing's gone wrong so far. So when somebody comes along and messes with that system, obviously this is a problem now. This is shaking things up. So as most of you famously know, right, this situation took place where many of the Shias had gathered, and the Imam was present in the gathering. And at this gathering, when they were trying to figure out who the Imam is, the uncle of the Imam there, Abdullah ibn Musa ibn Ja'far al-Ukalani, I think, Ukalani. So this is the 9th Imam's uncle, right? So the brother of the 8th Imam. He claimed imamat there. In that gathering, he claimed that he was the Imam, which also should kind of mess with our pattern recognition system too. Not all the Sadat are that great. Some of these ones were really messed up, right? A lot of them were claiming imamat for themselves, unfortunately, right? So this is also very confusing. So this, the 9th Imam's uncle is like, yes, I'm the Imam. Now you see, the ones who had that broken pattern recognition system, like, okay, right skin color, right age, let's go with that. Sounds good. There were some others there who say, no, hold on a second. It's not that simple. We need to put this person to the test. They had the correct pattern recognition system. So we're going to ask you some questions, and let's see the answers you give. So there's a couple questions that they asked. Because of time, I'm not going to go through all of them. So they asked one by one all these questions. And one by one, this uncle, this guy, Abdullah ibn Musa, was getting them wrong. One by one, wrong, wrong, wrong. When I say wrong, meaning that this group, these Shia, They knew the answer from the 8th Imam. They knew the answer from the 7th, from the 6th, from the 5th. They had carried on the proper patterns, right? The actual sunnah, the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam and the ulama. The answers they knew. So this was really a test that, hey, we know what the answer is. Let's see if you actually know what the answer is. Or, another way of putting it, we know what the principles are that the Ahlul Bayt have passed down. Let's see if you know these principles. There's some unknown variables. We as the Shias, in an unknown time, we know how to solve them. If you really are the Imam, you should know how to solve them too. You should know better than us. Let's see if you can solve. And he couldn't. He couldn't do that. And then in that gathering, when the 9th Imam was present, he came to his Imam and basically told him, Ya Amma, like, oh uncle, ittaqullah, like have taqwa. What are you doing? How are you claiming something like this for yourself? Why are you doing this? He said, it will be extremely difficult for you to stand in front of Allah after Yawm al-Qiyamah, when Allah is going to come and say to you, why were you giving fatwas when you had no ilm? Why were you going around and doing something like that? Why were you speaking out of turn? This was not within your jurisdiction. Why would you say something like this? And the uncle became embarrassed, obviously. But you see that even back then, and all these different, let's say, controversies or fitnas or difficulties that the Shias had every single generation of the Ahlul Bayt, there ended up being these sort of two different groups. One group thought that they understood the patterns that the Prophet and the rest of the Ahlul Bayt had left behind. But point after point after point, issue after issue after issue, mas'ala after mas'ala after mas'ala, they were getting it wrong. They were just messing up. Whether it was like a fiqhi issue, whether it was a political issue, right? Because we know even some Muslims, unfortunately, had supported and joined Ma'mun, even when the 8th Imam said, no, don't support Ma'mun, and don't support his brother Muhammad Amin. Don't work with any of them. Don't get involved in their conflict. This is not for you. Some Muslims didn't listen to the Imam and they just got involved anyway, right? Because of the whole lesser of two evils thing. Like, oh, he'll treat us better, right? Ma'mun will treat us better. They weren't listening and they went on and did their own thing. So one group, this trend sort of happened where they would never follow the correct patterns and the principles and the usul that the Ahlul Bayt had left. But another group had made sure that they learned the principles specifically that the Ahlul Bayt had left, and they utilized this every single time where necessary. Now, how are we going to apply this in our day and age? Well, there's a few different ways we can maybe look at this. If you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The first is this. Look, when we're in times of confusion, and let's be honest, we are in times of confusion. A lot of people love to say that, alhamdulillah, social media, YouTube, all this information's available, all these lectures, all these speakers and scholars. This is great. Isn't it great to have all this access? I'm like, well, you ask people, ask people in the medical community, is it good that you have pro-vaxxers and anti-vaxxers all having the same platform? Ask somebody in science, right, in like astronomy or cosmology, is it good that you have flat earthers and round earthers having the same platform? Things like that. Is it good that everybody, regardless of how much knowledge they have, all has the same equal platform? Is that actually a good thing or not? Another way of framing it is, have things as for us as Shias, have they become easier and clearer as time has gone on with this proliferation and expansion of knowledge? Or are more and more people saying, well, this person said that, this person said that, now I'm confused? Because I'll tell you my perspective, I've been hearing the latter more than anything else. I heard so-and-so from this country, and so-and-so's, I went through this lecture, or I read so-and-so's whatever's answer, I read this book, and now I don't know what to believe. Whereas when it was before, they had, let's say, one go-to alim, they'd have the question, get the answer, and they'd be satisfied. Now, the other example, obviously, clearly for that is moon sighting. The easiest and most, fitna-generating concept that exists among Shias. But this is a recent one. This didn't happen back in the day. Before any of this internet connection, social media, WhatsApp group stuff, nobody had any problems. Why? Because somebody in the community would do the difficult work of stepping outside, going to the proper area, look up, and either see it or not. That's all that was required. There's nothing difficult about that. Now you tell me, is that easy or difficult? Or is staying up till 3, 4 a.m., waiting for WhatsApp messages to come and hearing 40 different voice clips of people trying to explain back and forth, well, let me talk to you what a shared horizon actually is. What's going on here? This increase of information and technology, I'll tell you my own personal opinion, I don't think it's really helped out at all. I think it's confused people more than anything else. And that's one simple example, right? You can go to any other example, the same thing has applied there too, right? Before, we knew the fatwa, right? Somebody says, salam alaikum, wajib to reply alaikum salam. Now what happens? Okay, somebody said SA to me on WhatsApp. Is it wajib for me to reply or not? Somebody said it in an email. Somebody said it in a voice clip. So what happens when ChatGPT says salam to you? What are you going to do there? Is there a fatwa for him too? Like, what's going to happen over here? Right? Artificial intelligence. What if it starts becoming aware and self-aware? And, ChatGPT becomes self-aware and says, you know what? Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah. Like, what now? Do we have to treat ChatGPT a certain way? This stuff, as we're expanding and expanding, I think it's confusing people more than anything else. The more depth and breadth and all this stuff that we have, I don't actually think it's helping us out. It's creating more of this confusion. Now, as we're going through this, as you see with the ashab of the Imam, their way of dealing with this was research and investigation. Calm, right? Let's ask the questions. We're not going to start fitnas. We're not going to start ad hominem attacks and saying this person's a kafir or this person is not on the aqidah and any of that stuff. Say, look, it's a little confusing right now. Let me find somebody that's trustworthy, present the question, and do whatever investigation that I can handle. If I can't handle this, it's too much for me, then sometimes we don't have to even bother with it. If it's some of these, we say juz'i, particular detailed things, there's no point for us to go get involved, right? Let other ulama and maraja, let them hash it out and deal with it. A lot of these things don't even matter to you and I, right? All the time. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The second point is this. A lot of people, we have these top 10 Q&As that always happen in any gathering. Some of them always have to do with music, right? Marriage issues always come up. Moon sighting, obviously. Another one always has to do with what is our duty and how are we going to recognize the Imam of the time. That's almost everybody's, again, on their top 10 list. How do we know? People right now are claiming they're the 12th Imam, right? In Iraq, in Iran. There's, I think, somebody in Europe who's claimed that he's either the Imam or he's the official representative of the Imam. There's people who just pop out of nowhere and do that. And they get followings. People come and they arm themselves and go and support these people, unfortunately. And alhamdulillah, the authorities catch them and put them in jail. But people like that, they come up and people follow them. People are getting confused. Now, what's going to happen if, let's say, somebody, they drop in. They're wearing a certain kind of garb. And let's just say they use some specific cream that makes their face look Nurani or something, right? They're wearing all white. They come in on a white horse or something. I don't know, right? They create a fireball, they shoot a Kamehameha at you. I don't know, they do something that you would think is a mu'jiza. For a lot of people, that might be like, oh my God, that's got to be the 12th Imam. Why? Because their pattern recognition system is mu'jiza and all white, or have a specific voice, or say X, Y, Z. That might be their system. Is that the systems that the Imams left behind of how to recognize the next Imam? How would you actually recognize the real Imam? Before getting into all that, and I don't think I have time for that, I'd say, look, don't go all the way to the deep end in figuring out who's the 12th Imam. Very simple. How do you even figure out any Imam, lowercase I? Like an Imam that leads in namaz, in salah. How do you know who's supposed to lead you there? Many individuals, if you ask them, what are the shara'it and the conditions for somebody to lead salah? They might give you a few things like, okay, baligh, if it's a mixed gathering, male, they have to be sane, Shia, they'll give a bunch of random things like that, maybe. But if you push a bit more for the details, they probably won't be able to do that. Or more, even if they can, let's say, enumerate every single one of the conditions, if somebody unqualified actually comes up and leads namaz, whether it's here, or another center, or in another country, most Shias have no idea, especially when it comes to, let's say, Arabic pronunciation, whether this person's actually pronouncing it correct or not, right? Somebody who's clearly butchering the Arabic, right? They're literally reading namaz in Farsi or Urdu, for example, but people behind are like, oh, that's normal, right? Isn't that how it's supposed to be done? That's normal salah. Obviously, that's one of the conditions. It has to be properly recited. But many individuals don't know that. So you have, unfortunately, right, some places where individuals who never had the conditions, they themselves didn't know the conditions for namaz, didn't know basic Arabic, unfortunately. Everybody, lines and lines behind them, didn't know the conditions as well. So you have this whole gathering of an Imam and followers, of a community of just people who just don't know the basic credentials of a lowercase I Imam. And these people are asking then, that same group, hopefully, I'm sure not this group, but that same group is saying, okay, how do we recognize capital I Imam? Like you couldn't do lowercase I, how are you going to get to capital I? What if the capital I Imam comes and starts saying, wala zaleen? What are you going to do there? Inna atayna kal kawsar. Most people will be like, yeah, that sounds fine. I think that's it too. Right? There are so many things that are basic qualifications that have been mentioned in many different regards that we don't know. that pattern recognition system in every single regard. I gave a simple example of leading namaz. There's other examples of those who are supposed to lead communities, right? The actual rightful ulama. They've been mentioned in the riwayat. As I'm sure some of you have spoken recently, and I think it was discussed in one of these gatherings, of how do you actually determine who has credentials and who doesn't? How do you know what to look for and what not to look for, right? Do you go by the number of years that somebody spent? Do you figure out, okay, that this is the name of a school that I kind of randomly heard, like, is that good enough? What piece of information actually tells us whether somebody's qualified to speak on a certain thing or not? A lot of situations, somebody, whether it's just because of a turban or because of, let's say, academic credentials, whatever, they just are automatically imagined that they can speak about any concept whatsoever, anything at all. Right? Like, I've had people come to me and they say, look, can you address, somebody had asked me, like, can you do a session on how does somebody recover from a divorce, or something like that? Somebody asked me to address that. So look, I have no idea how to address that topic at all. Do you want me to just randomly do 5 minutes of research on alislam.org, come up with something and come and, give a bunch of random riwayat? Like, is that what you want? We should hope for and look for better, right? Like, okay, what are your qualifications? What's your expertise? What have you researched? Can somebody else actually back you up in this? Or are you kind of like a lone ranger and a rebel and, all this? What's actually going on? When we raise our level, then that keeps that imam, lowercase I, in check, that alim in check, which it should be. When the students raise their level, then the teacher says, okay, I can also raise my level too then, right? It's that sort of back and forth relationship. A teacher, an alim, will want to teach and give information as much as the students can handle. But if the students are not ready to handle that, then what is there to give then? So then our lesson over here is to figure out, do we have that proper pattern recognition system or not? What does that actually entail? Go back, find these things out. Again, you have local ulama here, you can ask them for that and give more specificity there. There are clear examples in every discipline. In fiqh, there's a pattern recognition system in terms of the usul and the fiqhi responses to things. There's a theological way of looking at things. There's these patterns that have been given to us that we can use, which at least will help us in our point of investigation, right? So hopefully, this was something I pray and hope was understood for today, inshallah ta'ala. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. In the same way that we see patterns in terms of the information that the Ahlul Bayt have left behind, we see patterns as well, interestingly enough, in their masa'ib as well. It's almost as if each imam is almost passing on this state of ghurba, this state of gham. And if you look at the way the Ahlul Bayt have been treated in each and every generation, the way that they achieved their shahada, the way that they were treated by the Muslims of their time, by the khulafa of those times, there's a pattern that you can pick out as well too. When we talk, for example, about Imam al-Jawad, as we know, according to some reports, he was poisoned by, according to some, by his wife, Fadl. Just like Imam Hasan was, right, according to some, poisoned by his wife. And many say that the poison that was given to Imam al-Jawad was similar to the poison that was given to Imam al-Hasan as well. That in riwayat, in history, they talk about the different types of poisons that were utilized, right, in that time. Sometimes there were poisons that were slow acting. They would take a long time to take effect. Others were quick acting. They were meant to try to bring somebody to death either right away or within 24 to 48 hours. They say the type of poison that was given to Imam al-Jawad was similar to the one that was given to Imam al-Hasan, such that it was so shadid, there was such shidda, such intensity in it, they say that his body, just like his forefather, had changed color. That immediately he felt this weakness, that it was difficult for him right away. With the ghurba and the difficulty that Imam al-Jawad had dealt with all due respect, I don't believe that the most difficult part of his life was actually in his shahada. Because adults, when they go through something, especially when it's an imam, they have this ma'rifah on a level where they can handle and they can go through things like this. It's not something that is unexpected from them. But when a child deals with difficulty, even when it's a child of ma'rifah, a child of the Ahlul Bayt, then we feel it. We feel that musibah a bit more. The musibah that I believe is more difficult, was more difficult for Imam al-Jawad, didn't happen when he was poisoned by his wife, but rather happened when he was just a young boy, maybe 8, 9 years old. They say that he had gone along with Imam al-Rida alayhi salam to Hajj. He was placed near Maqam Ibrahim. I'm sorry, he was only 4 or 5 years old, my mistake, 4 or 5 years old, very young. And Imam al-Rida was performing tawaf. And as he was performing tawaf, they say Imam al-Jawad was intently staring at him and watching his father perform this tawaf, and then he began to sigh. He began to moan and then began to cry. When the servant of Imam al-Rida came and tried to pick up Imam al-Jawad and say, it's time to go now, we're leaving this Hajj, we're trying to go back home now. They say Imam al-Jawad did not want to leave. He began crying more and more intensely. He said, no, I don't want to leave. And when the servant couldn't do anything, he ran to Imam al-Rida. He said, your son does not want to leave. I don't know what to do. I don't want to force him. Please come and help me. So Imam al-Rida comes. He says, Ya Bunayya, why don't you want to get up from here? Why are you staying here? What has happened to you? He says, Abata, Baba. He said, I watched the way that you were doing your tawaf. He said, the way that you were sending your salam to Allah, the way that you were doing this last and final ziyarah, I saw the way you were touching Hajr al-Aswad. I saw what you're doing. I recognize that this is the last time that you're going to be doing your Hajj. I recognize that this is probably the last time that I'll be able to see you and that you'll be leaving us very soon. And when we hear these kind of words, our heart has no choice but to go back to Sakina on those last few moments when she's holding the hind leg of Buljana, saying, Baba, Baba, I don't want Buljana to go back out. Every time the horses went out, they would never come back. When the horse took my Ammu Abbas, he never came back. When Ali al-Akbar went out, he never came back. لعنة الله على قوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائه وتسليما لأمره. ماتم حسين.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. Saf bana le. Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے زہرا جگر فگار ہے یوں غم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے آ جا گئی قضا کو بھی مولا حسن کی یاد آ جا گئی قضا کو بھی مولا حسن کی یاد ٹکڑے جگر ہوا وہی عالم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے ہر ایک محب ہے چاک غریباں بسد بکا ہر ایک محب ہے چاک غریباں بسد بکا ماتوں کو ناپدید پرنم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین تقی کا ہے چائن کے سر پہ یتیمی کی ایک گھٹا چائن کے سر پہ یتیمی کی ایک گھٹا ہے آج سوگوار جو ہمدم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین تقی کا ہے زخمی دل بطول تھا امت کے ظلم سے زخمی دل بطول تھا امت کے ظلم سے اس پہ مزید درد یہ پیہم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین تقی کا ہے ہوتی ہے اشک بار اجالوں کی انجمن ہوتی ہے اشک بار اجالوں کی انجمن اٹھتا جو آج نور مجسم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے بغداد کی زمین پہ ماتم تقی کا ہے پر محمد و آل محمد صلوات اللہ أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صل على محمد وآل محمد. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. حي على الصلاة، حي على الصلاة، حي على الفلاح، حي على الفلاح، حي على خير العمل، حي على خير العمل. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله، لا إله إلا الله. اللهم صل على
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله، أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله، أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم، وأن عليا ولي الله عليه الصلاة والسلام. حي على الصلاة، حي على الصلاة، حي على الفلاح، حي على الفلاح، حي على خير العمل، حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة، قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. استغفر الله من كل ذنب وأتوب إليه إنه كان توابا. الله أكبر. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع له لمن حمد. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد وأركع وأسجد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. كذلك الله ربنا. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. رب اجعل لي مقيم صلاتي ومن ذريتي ربنا وتقبل دعاء. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد الله أكبر أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد الله أكبر الحمد لله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بحول الله وقوته يقوم وأقعد وأركع وأسجد أستغفر الله من كل ذنب وأتوب إليه الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد الله أكبر أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم إلهي أنت كما نحب فاجعلنا كما تحب الله أكبر بسم الله وبالله والحمد لله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله اللهم صل على محمد
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أشهد أن عليا ولي الله أشهد أن عليا حجة الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الله أكبر بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله الله أكبر بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد رب اجعلني مقيم الصلاة ومن ذريتي ربنا وتقبل دعاء الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر أستغفر الله الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الحمد لله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده الله أكبر بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر الله أكبر سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلبي على دينك. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.